Welcome back, y'all. Two heartwarming tales, the place where every story warms your heart and reminds you what real kindness looks like. Before we get into today's story, go on and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. 'Cause today, we're telling you about a poor farmer who gave away the very last of his harvest to a starving family of strangers, never once imagining that one small act of kindness would come back, decades later, to save his own life. In the fall of 1934, in a dusty stretch of western Kansas that the newspapers had taken to call in the Dust Bowl, there lived a farmer named Samuel Hartley. Samuel had worked the same 100 acres his father had broken with a mule team some 40 years earlier, and for most of his life, that land had been kind to him. Good wheat in the spring, a fair corn crop come autumn, enough to keep his family fed and a little left over to sell at the co-op in town. But the drought that had settled over the plains those past few years had changed all that, turning rich black soil into cracked, wind-blown dust that choked the sky and buried fences whole. By that particular October, Samuel had managed, through sheer stubbornness and no small amount of prayer, to coax one final decent harvest out of a small, stubborn patch of ground near the creek bed that hadn't dried up entirely like the rest. It wasn't a much, a few sacks of wheat, some root vegetables, a modest crop of corn he'd been hoarding carefully, rationing it out to last through what he feared would be a long, hard winter. His wife had passed 2 years back from a fever the doctors in town couldn't rightly explain, and his own health had been declining slowly ever since, though he never spoke of it to anyone, not even his neighbors. Samuel lived alone in that little farmhouse, his children grown and scattered to find work in the cities, and he'd grown accustomed to the quiet, solitary rhythm of his days, tending what little crop remained, mending fences worn down by relentless wind, and praying each night that the following season might finally bring relief. He wasn't a wealthy man, not by any measure, but he was a proud one, determined to keep his small piece of land alive even as so many of his neighbors had already given up, packing their families into overloaded trucks and heading west toward California, chasing rumors of work in the orchards and fields. It was on a cold, gray afternoon in late October that Samuel first noticed the old truck cuming up the county road, sputtering and coughing black smoke, clearly on its last legs. He watched from his porch as it rolled to a stop near the edge of his property, the engine finally giving out entirely with a defeated wheeze. A man climbed out first, thin and weathered beyond his years, followed by a woman even thinner, and finally a small boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, his ribs visible beneath a threadbare shirt, 2 sizes too big. Samuel watched them a moment, recognizing immediately the particular kind of exhaustion etched into their faces, the look of folks who'd been too long on too little chasin work that always seemed to lie just a little further down the road. He set down the hoe he'd been using and walked toward the fence line, calling out a greeting so as not to startle them. "Afternoon," Samuel called. "Looks like your truck's given up on you." The man, introducing himself as Thomas Whitfield, explained apologetically that they'd been heading toward California. Chasin, word of work, picking fruit. But the truck had been struggling for miles now, and had finally quit entirely just shy of Samuel's property. He asked, hesitantly, almost ashamed to be asking at all, whether Samuel might know anyone nearby who could look at the engine, or perhaps let them rest a spell before continuing on foot. Samuel studied the family carefully, the woman, Ruth, cradling the boy's shoulder protectively, the boy himself staring at Samuel with the particular hollow-eyed look of a child who hadn't eaten a proper meal in longer than any child ought to go without one. Something in Samuel's chest tightened at the sight, a feeling he recognized immediately as the same helpless ache he'd felt watching his own children grow up during leaner years. Though never quite this lean. "Ain't much of a mechanic myself," Samuel admitted, "but I got a barn you're welcome to shelter in tonight, and I reckon I can rustle up something for you all to eat." "Can't have folks going hungry on my land, not while I got anything to spare," Thomas protested weakly, clearly uncomfortable accepting charity from a stranger, insisting they didn't want to be a burden. But Samuel, recognizing the particular pride of a man trying desperately to provide for his family despite having nothing left to provide with, simply shook his head firmly and gestured them toward the house. "Ain't charity," Samuel said gently. "Just neighbors helping neighbors, same as anybody would do for me if the shoe was on the other foot." That evening Samuel, prepared what modest supper he could manage from his carefully rationed stores, a simple stew of root vegetables, and the last of a chicken. He'd been savin, fresh bread baked from precious flour he'd been stretching to last the winter. He watched, with a mixture of satisfaction and quiet heartbreak, as the small boy ate like he hadn't seen a proper meal in weeks, which, as Thomas quietly explained later, wasn't far from the truth. Over supper, Thomas shared their story, how the drought had destroyed their own small farm to states over, how they'd sold what little they owned to buy gas money and set out west, chasing rumors of steady work, only to find themselves stranded, broke, and increasingly desperate with each passing mile. Ruth, quiet through most of the meal, finally spoke up, her voice trembling slightly, admitting that she'd begun to fear they wouldn't survive the journey at all, that little Michael had been growing weaker by the day. Samuel listened carefully, his own heart aching with recognition of a struggle he understood all too well, even if his own circumstances hadn't yet grown quite so desperate. As the family settled into the barn that night, wrapped in blankets Samuel provided, he lay awake in his own bed, turning over something in his mind that would ultimately change all their lives forever. By morning, Samuel had made his decision. He gathered nearly the entire remainder of his precious harvest. The sacks of wheat, the root vegetables, even a good portion of the corn he'd been rationing so carefully to last through winter, and loaded it all into the back of the family's truck, which a neighbor Samuel had summoned at first. Light had managed to coax back to life with some careful tinkering. Thomas stared at the loaded truck bed in stunned disbelief, insisting he couldn't possibly accept such generosity, that Samuel needed that harvest to survive his own winter. But Samuel, standing firm despite the family's protests, explained simply that he'd survived hard winters before, and that a family with a hungry child needed that food far more urgently than an old man living alone. "You'll make it further with full bellies than empty ones," Samuel said firmly, refusing to hear any further argument. "And when you get where you're going, and things turn around for you, and they will, mark my words, you just remember there's kindness left in this world, even in hard times. Pass it along when you're able." Ruth, tears streaming down her face, tried to thank him properly, but Samuel simply waved off her gratitude, telling her the greatest thing she could offer was making sure that boy of hers grew up strong and healthy. Little Michael, still too young to fully understand the magnitude of what had just occurred, simply hugged Samuel's leg tightly before climbing into the truck, cinching with him a memory that would linger unexpectedly for decades to come. As the truck pulled away down the dusty county road, disappearing finally over the horizon toward California and whatever uncertain future awaited them there, Samuel stood alone on his porch, watching until the dust settled entirely, uncertain himself how he'd manage the coming winter with so little lefty in reserve, yet feeling, despite the uncertainty, a profound and unexpected peace at having done what he believed, in his heart, to be simply the right thing. He couldn't have known, standing there, that gray October morning, that the small, starving boy he'd just fed and sent on his way would, some 30 years later, hold Samuel's very life in his hands. The Whitfield family's journey west, even with Samuel's generous gift of food sustaining them through the most difficult stretch of their travels, remained grueling and uncertain for many months following that fateful encounter. They arrived in California nearly 2 weeks after leaving Samuel's farm, finding the promised abundance of work considerably harder to secure than rumor had suggested, combating alongside thousands of other desperate families who'd made the same difficult journey westward, all chasing the same increasingly scarce opportunities. Thomas found sporadic work picking fruit in the orchards around the Central Valley, backbreaking labor that paid barely enough to keep the family fed, let alone save toward any semblance of a stable future. Ruth took in laundry and mending work whenever she could find it, while young Michael, despite his tender age, often accompanied his father into the fields, doing what small tasks a child his size could manage to help contribute to the family's survival. Yet despite the continued hardship, something had shifted within the Whitfield family following their encounter with Samuel Hartley. Thomas often spoke of the farmer's generosity during quiet evenings around whatever makeshift camp they'd established, reminding Michael repeatedly of the lesson Samuel had imparted, that kindness persisted even in the hardest of times, and that such kindness, on se recibed, carried with it a responsibility to be passed forward whenever circumstances allowed. Ruth, in particular, found herself deeply moved by the memory of Samuel's selfless generosity. often telling young Michael, as she tucked him into whatever temporary shelter they'd found for the night, that someday, when he was grown and capable, he ought to find some way to repay such kindness, even if he could never track down the specific farmer who'd shown it to them. Not every debt gets repaid to the person who gave the gift, Ruth would tell him softly. Sometimes we repay such kindness simply by carrying it forward, by being that same kind of generous soul to someone else in need. Someday, when we're able. Michael, though young, absorbed these lessons deeply. The memory of that gray October morning, of the kind old farmer who'd given away nearly everything he had to feed a family of complete strangers, remaining etched permanently in his young mind, shaped his character in ways neither Thomas nor Ruth could have fully anticipated at the time. As the years passed, the Whitfield family's fortunes gradually began improving. Thomas eventually secured steady, permanent work at a large agricultural operation outside Fresno, earning enough to finally establish a small, stable home for his family after years of uncertain, itinerant labor. Ruth found steady employment as well, working in a local general store, her natural kindness and diligence earning her the trust and respect of the store's owner. Michael, meanwhile, excelled remarkably in school. His natural intelligence and fierce determination gained the attention of his teachers early on. Despite the family's continued modest circumstances, Michael's teachers repeatedly encouraged Thomas and Ruth to nurture their son's evident academic gifts, recognizing in him a rare combination of sharp intellect and genuine compassion for others, qualities that would serve him remarkably well in whatever path he eventually chose to pursue. By the time Michael reached his teenage years, he'd developed a particular fascination with medicine, inspired partly by witnessing firsthand, during those difficult early years of poverty and hardship, just how devastating illness and lack of proper medical care could be for families without adequate resources. He often spoke, with the same quiet determination his parents had displayed throughout those hard years, of his dream to someday become a doctor, to help families like his own, who'd struggled so desperately during those difficult times. Thomas and Ruth, despite their own limited means, worked tirelessly to support Michael's ambitious dream, saving every spare penny they could manage, encouraging him constantly in his studies, reminding him regularly of Samuel Hartley's selfless generosity as inspiration for the kind of compassionate doctor they hoped he might someday become. That old farmer gave us everything he had, expecting nothing in return. Thomas would remind his son often. Imagine what kind of doctor you could be, Michael, if you carried that same spirit into your work. Helping folks, not because you're owed something, but simply because it's the right thing to do. Michael took these lessons to heart profoundly, working tirelessly throughout his high school years, eventually earning a scholarship to attend college, followed by acceptance into medical school, an extraordinary achievement for a boy who'd once nearly starved on the side of a dusty Kansas road, dependent entirely on the kindness of a stranger to survive. Throughout his years of rigorous medical training, Michael never forgot the lessons Samuel Hartley had taught him, even if the specific memory of the farmer's face had begun, understandably, to fade somewhat with the passage of so many years. He carried forward, instead, the deeper lesson his parents had continually reinforced, that true medicine, true healing, required not just technical skill, but genuine compassion, a willingness to serve patients regardless of their ability to pay, regardless of their circumstances. Upon completing his medical training, Michael made a deliberate choice that surprised many of his colleagues, who'd expected him to pursue a lucrative practice in one of California's growing cities. Instead, Michael chose to specialize in rural medicine, drawn by an inexplicable pull towards serving communities similar to the one where his own family had once struggled so desperately, communities often overlooked and underserved by the broader medical establishment. He spent his early career moving between various rural clinics throughout the Midwest, building a reputation as a skilled, compassionate physician to travel considerable distances to treat patients who couldn't otherwise access proper medical care. Though he rarely spoke openly about the specific inspiration behind his chosen path, those closest to him understood that his dedication stemmed directly from lessons learned during his family's own desperate struggles decades earlier. Meanwhile, back in Kansas, Samuel Hartley continued working his small farm alone, year after year, through droughts and floods, through good harvests and lean ones, never leaving the land his father had first broken so many decades before. He rarely spoke of that particular family he'd helped so many years earlier, thought of them often in quiet moments, wondering occasionally whatever had become of that small, hollow-eyed boy he'd fed on that cold October morning. Hoping fervently that life had eventually treated him kindly. As the decades passed, Samuel's own health began gradually declining. The hard physical labor of farming taken its inevitable toll on a body that had worked tirelessly, without complaint, for the better part of 70 years. Neighbors occasionally urged him to consider slowing down, perhaps selling off portions of his land, moving closer to town where medical care might be more readily accessible. But Samuel, stubborn as ever, insisted on remaining independent for as long as he possibly could. He couldn't have known, as he continued his quiet, solitary existence on that small Kansas farm, that the small boy he'd once fed with the last of his own harvest had grown into a skilled, compassionate doctor, or that fate, in its own mysterious way, was already beginning to weave the threads that would eventually bring their paths crossing once again, decades after that single, selfless act of kindness on a cold autumn morning. The years following Samuel's generous gift to the Whitfield family proved considerably difficult for the aging farmer, testing repeatedly his resolve and independence as both his land and his own body continued weathering the passage of time. The winter immediately following his encounter with the Whitfields had indeed proven as harsh as he'd feared, his depleted stores leaving him considerably leaner and more strained than usual, though he'd managed, through careful rationing and no small amount of determination, to survive until spring planting brought renewed hope. The years that followed brought a slow, gradual recovery to the region as the worst of the Dust Bowl drought finally began easing. Rains gradually returned to nourish the parched Kansas soil once again. Samuel's small farm, like many others throughout the region, slowly began recovering its former productivity, though the difficult years had left permanent marks, both on the land itself and on Samuel's own aging body, which had grown increasingly frail from decades of relentless physical labor combined with periods of genuine deprivation. Samuel never remarried following his wife's passing, choosing instead to dedicate himself entirely to maintaining the family farm, even as his own children, now grown and settled in various cities across the country, repeatedly urged him to consider joining them, to finally rest after a lifetime of hard labor. But Samuel, stubborn and fiercely independent, always insisted the farm was his responsibility, his legacy, and that he intended to remain there for as long as his body allowed. By the time Samuel reached his 70s, his health had begun declining more seriously. Arthritis settling painfully into joints, worn down by decades of physical labor. His heart, doctors in town occasionally warned during rare visits, showing signs of strain that concerned them considerably. Yet Samuel continued working his land regardless, rising each morning before dawn out of sheer habit and stubborn pride, refusing to accept that his working days might finally be drawing to a close. His neighbors, many of whom had known Samuel his entire life, watched with growing concern as his health continued, though Samuel himself remained characteristically tight-lipped about his struggles, refusing to burden others with what he considered his own private difficulties. Occasionally, younger farmers in the area would quietly assist him with the heavier tasks around the farm. Tog Samuel, ever proud, accepted such help only reluctantly, and only when absolutely necessary. One particularly difficult winter, when Samuel was 73 years old, he suffered a serious fall while attempting to repair storm damage to his barn roof, breaking his hip severely enough to require hospitalization in the nearest town, some 20 miles distant. The recovery proved long and arduous, testing Samuel's resolve more severely than perhaps any challenge he'd faced since those difficult Dust Bowl years, decades earlier. During his lengthy recovery, confined largely to a hospital bed and later a wheelchair as he slowly regained mobility, Samuel found himself, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, forced to confront seriously the question of whether he could continue managing the farm entirely alone. His children, alarmed by news of his accident, urged him more insistently than ever to consider selling the property and moving somewhere he could receive proper ongoing care. But Samuel, even in his weakened state, continued resisting such suggestions. The local doctor overseeing Samuel's recovery, a kind but overworked physician named Dr. Alan Cross, grew increasingly concerned about Samuel's overall health during this period, noting troubling signs of cardiac strain that suggested more serious underlying issues than the hip fracture alone. He recommended, repeatedly, that Samuel consider seeing a specialist for a more thorough cardiac evaluation, though the nearest specialists capable of such advanced care were located considerably further away. In larger cities, Samuel had rarely, if ever, visited throughout his entire life. Samuel, ever practical and increasingly aware of his own mortality following the severity of his recent accident, began slowly, reluctantly, making preparations for the eventual transition of his farm. Though he remained determined to continue living independently for as long as circumstances reasonably allowed. He gradually reduced the scope of his farming operations, selling off portions of livestock, focusing primarily on maintaining just enough of the land to sustain himself comfortably without exhausting his diminishing physical capabilities. Despite the hardships of these later years, Samuel maintained a quiet, steady dignity throughout his continued struggles, rarely complaining, finding genuine contentment in simple daily routines. Tending his modest garden, read in by lamplight in the evenings, occasionally receiving visits from neighbors or his children when they managed the journey back to Kansas to check on him. He often reflected during these quiet moments on the choices he'd made throughout his long life, finding particular comfort and pride in recalling that cold October morning decades earlier when he'd given away nearly everything to help a desperate family of strangers. Ain't never regretted that decision, Samuel would often tell visiting neighbors who occasionally brought up the old, half-remembered story, which had taken on something of a local legend status over the passing decades. Whatever became of that family, I hope life treated him kindly. Sometimes the best decisions a man makes are the ones that cost him the most in the moment. As Samuel entered his late 70s, his cardiac health continued gradually deteriorating, despite Dr. Cross's best efforts at managing his condition through available local resources. The rural clinics simply lacked the specialized equipment and expertise necessary to properly diagnose and treat whatever underlying condition was increasingly straining Samuel's aging heart. Levine, both doctor and patient, increasingly concerned about what the coming years, or even months, might hold. It was during this particularly difficult period, as Samuel's health hung increasingly in the balance, that fate intervened in a manner neither Samuel nor anyone else could have possibly anticipated. Word had recently spread throughout the rural Kansas medical community about a new traveling medical initiative, spearheaded by a respected physician from California, dedicated specifically to bringing advanced cardiac care to underserved rural communities throughout the Midwest. Communities much like the one where Samuel had spent his entire life. Dr. Cross, desperate to secure better care for his aging, increasingly fragile patient, immediately reached out to inquire whether Samuel might qualify for this specialized traveling medical program. Uncertain whether the renowned visiting physician, said to be arriver in the region within the coming weeks, would have availability to examine someone in Samuel's particular circumstances. Neither Dr. Krause nor Samuel himself had any way of knowing that the celebrated physician, now bringing specialized cardiac care to rural Kansas communities, was none other than Dr. Michael Whitfield, the very same hollow-eyed, starving young boy Samuel had once fed with the last of his precious harvest, now grown into one of the most respected rural medicine specialists in the country, still guided, even after all these years, by the profound lesson in selfless kindness he'd learned on a cold Kansas roadside so many decades before. Dr. Michael Whitfield had built, over the course of nearly 3 decades, practicing medicine, a distinguished reputation throughout rural medical communities for his exceptional skill, tireless dedication, and unwavering commitment to serving patients, regardless of their financial circumstances. His particular specialty in cardiac care, combined with his deeply held belief that quality medical treatment shouldn't be limited only to those living near major metropolitan hospitals, had led him to establish an innovative traveling medical program, bringing specialized care directly to underserved rural communities throughout the Midwest. By the time he reached his mid-40s, Dr. Whitfield's traveling initiative had grown considerably, staffed by a small team of dedicated colleagues who shared his commitment to accessible rural health care. Their work took them through dozens of small towns annually, providing specialized cardiac consultations, diagnostic testing, and treatment planning for patients who otherwise would have faced considerable difficulty accessing such advanced medical care, often having to travel hundreds of miles to reach the nearest qualified specialist. When word reached Dr. Whitfield's team about an aging Kansas farmer named Samuel Hartley, suffering from concerning cardiac symptoms that his local rural physician lacked the resources to properly diagnose and treat, it registered simply as one among dozens of similar requests his program regularly received. Dr. Whitfield reviewed the case notes Dr. Krause had forwarded, Noting the concerning symptoms described, scheduling Samuel among the patients he intended to personally examine during visit to the region. Dr. Whitfield's traveling clinic arrived in the small Kansas town, near Samuel's farm on a crisp autumn morning, remarkably similar in feel, though Dr. Whitfield himself had long since forgotten the specific details, to that fateful October morning decades earlier. When his own family had first encountered Samuel's generosity, the clinic, established temporarily in the town's small community center, quickly filled with patients eager to receive the specialized cardiac care so rarely available in their remote rural community. Samuel, transported to the temporary clinic by a kind neighbor who'd insisted on dribbing him, despite Samuel's characteristic reluctance to impose upon others, waited patiently among the other patients, uncertain what exactly to expect from this renowned traveling physician he'd heard so much about from Dr. Cross and other grateful community members, whose own health had benefited from similar visits in neighboring towns. When Samuel's turn finally arrived, he was escorted into a small, temporarily converted examination room where Dr. Whitfield, now a distinguished, silver-haired physician in his mid-40s, greeted him with the same warm, genuine compassion that had earned him such widespread respect throughout the rural medical community. Dr. Whitfield reviewed Samuel's case notes carefully, asking detailed questions about his symptoms, his medical history, his overall circumstances, listening intently and compassionately to every response. As the examination progressed, Dr. Whitfield's genuine warmth and thorough attentiveness gradually put Samuel at ease. The elderly farmer finding himself, somewhat to his own surprise, opening up more candidly than he typically did with medical professionals, sharing details about his long life on the farm, his late wife, his scattered children, and, eventually, almost as an afterthought, mentioning briefly a memory from many decades earlier, a family of strangers he'd once helped during the difficult Dust Bowl years. Whitfield, focused intently on completing his thorough cardiac assessment, listened with professional attentiveness to Samuel's rambling reminiscences, finding himself genuinely moved, as he often was, by the resilience and quiet dignity so many of his rural patients displayed despite decades of hardship and struggle. Something about Samuel's particular story, however, struck an unexpectedly familiar chord within him, though he couldn't immediately place why. "You said this family you helped?" Dr. Whitfield asked, something in his physician's intuition suddenly compelling him to inquire further. "Do you recall, perhaps, where they might have been headed, or any particular details about them?" Samuel, surprised by the doctor's sudden interest in what he'd considered merely an old, half-forgotten story, shared what details he still remembered clearly after so many decades. A family named Whitfield, heading toward California during the worst of the drought years. A young boy, painfully thin, who'd eaten like he hadn't seen a proper meal in weeks. Dr. Whitfield froze, his professional composure momentarily faltering as the pieces of a memory he'd long considered simply a cherished but somewhat hazy childhood recollection suddenly snapped into startling, undeniable clarity. He set down his stethoscope carefully, studying Samuel's weathered face with fresh, searching intensity, searching for details that might confirm the increasingly powerful suspicion rapidly forming in his mind. "Mr. Hartley," Dr. Whitfield said slowly, his voice carrying an emotion that surprised even himself. Did you happen to catch their names?" "The father's name, specifically." Samuel, increasingly puzzled by the doctor's evident emotional reaction, thought back carefully through the fog of so many passing decades. "Thomas, I believe. Thomas Whitfield. Kind man, desperate circumstances, but proud despite everything. Had a wife, Ruth, and a young boy, Michael, if memory serves correctly." The examination room fell into stunned silence as Dr. Michael Whitfield, one of the most respected rural cardiac specialists in the entire country, found himself staring, overwhelmed with emotion, at the very same farmer who had, some 30 years earlier, given away nearly everything he owned to save Michael's own starving family during the darkest days of the Dust Bowl. "Mr. Hartley," Dr. Whitfield finally managed, his voice thick with barely controlled emotion. "I am Michael Whitfield. That starving boy you fed, all those years ago, on that cold October morning. That was me." A debt finally repaid, Samuel stared at Dr. Whitfield in stunned, overwhelmed disbelief. The weathered lines of his aged face reflecting a complex mixture of shock, profound emotion, and gradual, joyful recognition as the impossible reality of this unexpected reunion slowly settled over him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The weight of 30 years and countless miles suddenly, remarkably, collapsing into a single, extraordinary moment of recognition. "Michael," Samuel finally whispered, his own voice trembling with emotion he rarely allowed himself to display so openly. "That little boy, you've grown into quite a remarkable man." Dr. Whitfield, momentarily setting aside his professional composure entirely, reached out and clasped Samuel's weathered hand firmly between both of his own, tears glistening unashamedly in his eyes. "Mr. Hartley, you have no idea, no possible way of understanding just how profoundly that single act of kindness shaped the entire course of my life. Everything I've become, everything I've dedicated my career to achieving, traces directly back to that cold October morning when you gave my family everything you had, expecting nothing whatsoever in return." Samuel, overwhelmed by the emotional weight of this extraordinary reunion, found himself momentarily unable to respond, simply gripping Dr. Whitfield's hand tightly. The years of hardship, sacrifice, and quiet uncertainty about whatever had become of that desperate young family suddenly, remarkably, resolving into this profound, unexpected moment of connection and gratitude. Once both men had regained sufficient composure, Dr. Whitfield insisted on conducting an unusually thorough examination of Samuel's cardiac condition, drawing upon every ounce of his considerable expertise and experience to properly diagnose the underlying issue that had been troubling Samuel's aging heart. The diagnosis, when it finally came, revealed a serious but treatable condition, a significant blockage that, left unaddressed, would likely have proven fatal within a matter of months, but which, with proper specialized surgical intervention, could be effectively treated, potentially adding many healthy years to Samuel's remaining life. Dr. Whitfield, recognizing immediately the severity and urgency of Samuel's condition, made arrangements personally to ensure Samuel received the necessary surgical treatment at the finest available cardiac facility, insisting on overseeing the entire treatment process himself, despite the considerable disruption this would cause to his own demanding travel schedule. He refused, adamantly, to accept any payment whatsoever for his services, insisting that whatever debt existed between them had been established decades earlier, and that this was simply his opportunity, finally, to repay it. "You gave my family everything you had when we were complete strangers, expecting nothing in return," Dr. Whitfield told Samuel firmly, when the elderly farmer attempted, out of characteristic pride, to insist on paying for at least a portion of his treatment. "The very least I can do, after all these years, is ensure you receive the same selfless generosity you once showed us, without hesitation, without expectation of repayment." Samuel's surgery, performed several weeks later at a specialized cardiac facility Dr. Whitfield had arranged, proved entirely successful, the elderly farmer's recovery progressing remarkably well under the careful, attentive supervision of the very physician whose life he'd once saved, quite unknowingly, so many decades earlier. Throughout Samuel's recovery, Dr. Whitfield made a point of visiting personally whenever his demanding schedule allowed, the two men developing, over these extended visits, a genuine friendship built upon their extraordinary shared history. During these visits, Dr. Whitfield shared with Samuel the full story of his family's subsequent journey, the difficult years following their departure from Samuel's farm, his parents' eventual establishment of a stable life in California, his own academic achievements and decision to pursue medicine specifically inspired by witnessing firsthand, throughout his childhood, the devastating consequences of inadequate healthcare access for impoverished families. He explained, in considerable detail, how his parents had repeatedly reminded him throughout his childhood of Samuel's selfless generosity, instilling in him from an early age the profound importance of compassion and service toward others, regardless of personal cost or expectation of reward. "My mother always told me," Dr. Whitfield recalled fondly during one such a visit, "that sometimes we repay kindness not to the person who originally gave it, but by carrying that same spirit forward into our own lives, helping others whenever circumstances allow. I've tried, throughout my entire career, to honor that lesson, though I never imagined I'd have the extraordinary opportunity to repay you directly." So many years later, Samuel, deeply moved by learning the full extent of the impact his simple act of kindness had ultimately produced, found himself reflecting often, during his recovery, on the profound, unpredictable ways in which genuine compassion could ripple outward through time, touching lives in ways the original giver could never possibly anticipate or fully comprehend. As Samuel's health continued improving steadily following his successful surgery, Dr. Whitfield made arrangements to ensure the elderly farmer received ongoing high-quality medical care through his traveling programs, regular visits to the region, personally checking on Samuel's progress whenever his schedule permitted, the two men's friendship deepening considerably throughout these continued interactions. Word of this extraordinary reunion between the aging Kansas farmer and the renowned traveling physician gradually spread throughout the local community, inspiring considerable local interest and admiration for the remarkable story of kindness rewarded. Decades after the original selfless act had seemingly been forgotten by all but Samuel himself, local newspapers eventually picked up the heartwarming story, further cementing what had already become something of local legend into a widely celebrated tale of the profound, far-reaching power of genuine, selfless kindness. Samuel, in his remaining years, lived considerably longer and healthier than anyone, including Dr. Whitfield himself, had initially anticipated. His successfully treated heart, allowing him to continue enjoying his beloved farm, tending his modest garden, and receiving regular, cherished visits from the man he'd once fed as a starving child decades earlier. He often reflected, during these peaceful later years, that the single, difficult decision to give away nearly everything he owned to a family of desperate strangers had ultimately proven, in ways he could never have possibly anticipated at the time, to be among the wisest, most rewarding choices of his entire, long life. Dr. Whitfield, for his part, continued his tireless dedication to providing accessible, compassionate medical care to underserved rural communities throughout the remainder of his distinguished career, often sharing Samuel's remarkable story with his own students and colleagues as a powerful illustration of the profound, unpredictable ways in which selfless kindness, extended without any expectation of reward, could ultimately transform lives across generations, echoing outward through time in ways the original giver could never fully anticipate. That's the thing about real kindness, Samuel would often tell visitors during his peaceful final years, seated comfortably on his familiar porch, watching the Kansas sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. You never know, when you're doing right by a stranger, just how far that kindness might travel, or how it might someday, in ways you could never possibly imagine, find its way right back to you. That's today's story, y'all. If this tale of selfless generosity and its remarkable, unexpected rewards touched your heart, don't forget to hit subscribe and share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, always finds its way back around. We'll see you in the next heartwarming tale.